Reading from Leviticus chapter 19, verses 1 to 8. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make for yourselves any gods of cast metal. I am the Lord your God. When you offer a sacrifice of peace offering to the Lord, you shall offer it so that you may be accepted. It shall be eaten the same day you offer it or on the day after, and anything left over until the third day shall be burned up with fire. If it is eaten at all on the third day, it is tainted, it will not be accepted, and everyone who eats it shall bear his iniquity, because he has profaned what is holy to the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from his people. When the Almighty, all-knowing God says something about himself, we can only understand it from seeing him in action. One thing that God repeats about himself is that he is holy. We see that repeated during the construction and functioning of the tabernacle. What does it mean? How are we to understand it? Every characteristic of God is explained through the instructions that govern the behavior of his people. In Genesis 1, we read that man is created in the image of God. In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth and found it void and without form. He filled the earth with his creation and demonstrated his dominion over them by deciding their purpose. What did he ask man to do? In verse 28, and God blessed them. And God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So man is the image or the reflection of who God is. This is one of the reasons why God prohibited the making of images for worship. God has already set his image in man. Any image man worships will not reflect God, but at best the reflection of himself, and at worst a reflection of something far less than even himself. The definition of holiness of God is progressive in nature. This chapter gives insight into his character by reiterating the previously given commandments and then adding more as they progress into the land of Canaan, where they would face new challenges concerning their living. The people of God would see many practices that they had never encountered and would be tempted to copy them as a way of life. Some of the key ideas of this chapter include the worship of God, our attitude towards your parents, your attitude towards your neighbor, your attitude towards your body, your attitude towards strange practices of the land, your attitude towards other creations of God, and your attitude toward the elderly and strangers in the land. God wanted his holiness to be reflected in all these areas. Some of these commandments are straightforward and can be copied into our life word for word, while others teach us a greater reality. The commands to reverence mother and father were in verse 3, to avoid idols in verse 4, and not to steal and deal falsely or lie in verse 11, or fall in the first category, and are all directly applicable to us. While others, like the command prohibiting the eating of the fruit of the trees which the Israelites planned until the 5th year, found in verse 23 to 25, and the prohibition of mixing cattle, crops, or kinds of materials in verse 19, may not directly apply to us, but they show us the divine nature and describe holiness. Let us take an example that Paul quotes in the New Testament. We read in Deuteronomy chapter 25 verse 4, You shall not muzzle an ox when it is treading out the grain. Paul quotes this 2 times in his epistles, once in 1 Corinthians 9 verse 9, and the second time in 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 18. He does so to make it clear that he or those who minister in the church have a right to be supported financially as a minister of the gospel. Moses seems compassionately concerned about the oxen getting enough to eat and getting their fair share when working hard. But Paul asks these rhetorical questions. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? When Paul says this is not really about the oxen, he's pointing to this as a revelation of God's justice. He suggests that Christians should want and arrange for those who labor sincerely among them, making sure they benefit first from their giving. Similarly, when God prohibits mixing cattle, crops, and kinds of materials, he is primarily concerned about ensuring that we understand how purposefully he has set each species in its own niche, each thing for its use, and he does not want them to intermingle and lose their divinely ordained identity. In verse 26, God says, "You shall not eat any flesh with the blood in it. You shall not interpret omens or tell fortunes. You shall not round off the hair on your temples or mar the edges of your beard. You shall not make any cuts on your body for the dead or tattoo yourself. I am the Lord." These practices were commonly found among the pagans that lived among them and expressed superstitious fear and the desire to appease the natural and supernatural forces surrounding them. Through these commands, we understand how much God values our lives when we hear him forbidding the eating of flesh with its blood, that is, its life still in it. We also understand how he views the body he has made for each human being as sacred, a fitting vessel for God's service. The way we treat the elderly, the weak, and strangers in the land is a reflection of the holiness of God. A simple and practical instruction like, "You shall stand before the gray-haired and honor the face of an old man," is directly connected to the fear of God as reflected in honor towards those who are venerable and thus in even a tiny way mirroring the Ancient of Days. In these last days, where in the words of Paul, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with deceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. These words are very relevant. God speaks about manifesting the holiness of God in terms of impartiality and truthfulness in the day-to-day business transactions when they sell their agricultural produce to others. He says in verse 35 onwards, "You shall do no wrong in judgment, in measures of length or weight or quantity. You shall have just balances, just weights, a just ephah and a just hin. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And you shall observe all my statutes and all my rules and do them. I am the Lord." As followers of God who had to give up the life of his son to redeem us, we ought to understand better than anyone else that there is no partiality with God. And we ought to observe the same principles. We ought to judge ourselves with the same strictness with which we judge others. We ought to weigh our own motives and actions on the same grounds on which we weigh that of others. To live a holy life is to imitate God, who alone is holy in his eternal law. Paul says in Ephesians 5:1, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ also loved us." Holiness begins and ends in love. Thus, when our Lord came to the earth and lived under the law, fully keeping the law, and transcending it in his grace and truth, he manifested the meaning of God's holiness to men. He summarized the whole of the law in Matthew 22:37. "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might." This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, "You shall love thy neighbor as yourself." He said, "On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. In him, we see the true meaning of holiness, a holiness that is not contaminated by his living among those who have fallen, but strong enough to communicate itself at any cost to those he loves. He guarded his heart and mind and flesh zealously against all impurity and disobedience, but opened them to welcome and comfort sinner nonetheless. May God enlarge our hearts likewise, that as purified and sanctified people of God, we may open the treasures of mercy and kindness to those in great spiritual and physical need around us. God bless.